Welcome everybody for the second session of the day. We are talking about guidance for the biodiversity credit market. So I'm joined today by a nice panel including Timothy Mail from Policy Innovation Center, Sinclair Vincent from Verra, Mauricio Serna from Terrasos, and Simon Morgan from ValueNature. So we have already heard something about biodiversity credits yesterday, so I'm not going to go over it again, and also we probably, our speakers will clarify, but again, we are talking about biodiversity credits, so these are actions that contribute to positive outcomes. We are not talking about biodiversity offsets that are used for redressing the impact of a company. So we are in the space of positive, and we are talking about biodiversity credit. Specifically, we are going to talk about the Biodiversity Credit Alliance. Yesterday, this was mentioned during the presentation, our colleague from UNDP, Midori Paxton, and is one of the initiatives that UNDP has launched in the past to support markets and market finance for nature and climate. So without further ado, I'd like to ask, we have only half hour for this very important session. I will ask my colleagues to introduce themselves and start with a general reflection on what you think are the opportunities and how the biodiversity credit market will complement the voluntary carbon market for natural climate solutions. So let me start with Tim. Let's go this way. Just tell us who you are and what are your reflections on these 2 points.
Great. Tim Mail, pleasure to meet you all. Executive director of a nonprofit whose acronym is EPIC. Don't worry about the words. And a lot of my background is based in the United States. And what we have seen, what the meta-analyses show is that from a restoration perspective, we can get about 75% of biodiversity back in a fully restored wetland or stream ecosystem. And in fact, we've done, all of us, thousands, tens of thousands of restoration projects around the world. So the potential that I see from the biodiversity credit market is to create a lot more information a lot sooner on how to lift up, how to create a delta for nature that has a market value and is easily transactable. And a lot of my experience comes from the offset market because there's many regulated ecosystems in the United States for which there are multi-billion-dollar markets. But for me, that potential to put biodiversity on the table as something that has an easily transactable value is the key thing that I see. And just to contrast it with carbon a little bit, and I'll use sort of a general term, I think of like carbon as like watching a chess game. I mean, yes, there's a few of us who are interested in the actual work of the transactions, but at the end of the day, right, there aren't nature channels on TV. There isn't a David Attenborough for carbon projects. There's a David Attenborough for nature. And people will just value seeing and experiencing and connecting to nature over and over and over again. So, carbon is fine and is big and has a really important connection to climate change, but biodiversity is like the soccer, right, of the offset space, of the credit space, right? Like you can get a jaguar, right? That's what we're adding, is something that really connects to people, and that at the end of the day, as biodiversity gets rarer and rarer over the next 100 years, people are going to value it more and more. It's going to have more and more business value. So that's the way we think of it, is being able to make what is right now sort of an anecdotal space into one that is very quantifiable and with very real gains, very real additionality.
Thank you, Team. Sinclair, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you again. I'm Sinclair Vincent, Director of Sustainable Development Innovation at Verra, leading the development of our nature crediting framework or biodiversity methodology. And I think, I absolutely agree, I think there's a major opportunity both in how we can help carbon projects demonstrate their concrete biodiversity outcomes and improvements, as well as in projects that maybe don't have additionality when it comes to carbon, but desperately need finance to restore or conserve the biodiversity in a landscape. And I think, again, picking up on some of the differences with carbon, as I mentioned yesterday, we're not going to have a ton of CO2 equivalent type metric when it comes to biodiversity crediting. But we need to get to some kind of unit that can have broad recognition so that it feels a little bit more like an ice cream shop. You walk in, you're getting ice cream, but there's a lot of different flavors and people are going to have different values on whether it's a particular keystone species or a particular highly intact landscape that's really important to their value chain, whatever it may be. And I think we need to be okay with all of those different flavors because nature, that's how nature works, and that's how it works best. So I think that's the key difference then compared to carbon that we really need to kind of allow to flourish while we develop all these different protocols and methodologies.
Thank you, Mauricio.
So hi everyone, I'm Mauricio Serna. I'm lead specialist in Terrasos. So I'm going to talk a little about Terrasos because I don't know if anyone knows what Terrasos is. So we're a Colombian company. We structure and operate biodiversity conservation projects and investments in Colombia. We've been, as Tim, we've been for the last 10 years helping companies reduce, mitigate, and offset their impacts in Colombia, and we pioneered habitat banking models in Colombia. So we created biodiversity credits for the compliance market, and we have over 4,000 hectares structured in habitat banking. So in this process, we identified the need and the opportunity, as Verra did, to create a new product, so a new product for biodiversity market to the voluntary market. And we've been doing this for almost 2 years now. We've been selling, we structured a project for biodiversity voluntary market in Colombia, and we've been selling credits for almost 6 months now. And I think there's a great opportunity, as Tim said, that people can engage with biodiversity and people can actually see biodiversity, and not only from the perspective of engagement, but also from the perspective of like designing and co-designing indicators and relevant indicators with biodiversity custodians, but also with the board of companies that want to have biodiversity targets. So we can co-design these indicators with them, and this will give them engagement with the projects and with the targets.
Simon.
Thanks. Simon Morgan from ValueNature. ValueNature is a biodiversity credit developer. I think the opportunity in the biodiversity space is, we heard a lot in the last session about co-benefits coming from carbon projects, but I think we could reframe a lot of that in the carbon space. When we think about carbon from a nature-based solution perspective, it's essentially a biodiversity project. And so our opportunity here is to reframe how we think about carbon, how we think about any of these ecological gains that come from these projects on the ground. And the opportunity, as well as the biodiversity, as we've heard, is more tangible. Community custodians understand biodiversity better than they might be able to understand carbon. And I think the opportunity here is for community-driven projects, rather than trying to get community buy-in to a project, rather have the communities driving the projects because they're ultimately the custodians of it. And I think that would have huge value for biodiversity and carbon markets at the same time if we are able to reframe how we think about these ecological gains coming from these systems and where the drivers are being. Yeah.
So I think this is very interesting and positive because in my view it's really important that we try to bring the carbon market along in the biodiversity market together in a way that we are not, developing a new market at the expense of the other. And I'm very pleased to hear all the positive things that you're saying, especially that the biodiversity credit market could complement for projects, for example, that don't have a chance because they don't have a lot of carbon, mitigation potential, for example, or the carbon will not be sufficient to finance the very expensive restoration, for example. So on this, and it's interesting, we have here different actors along the value chain. So let's talk about the infrastructure, right? That specifically talking about BCA, the Biodiversity Credit Alliance. What do you think, and I'm starting with you, Simon, that you're the closest to the UNDP colleagues who cannot be here today. What is the vision there, right? There are a lot of initiatives popping out there. Are we seeing, again, a confused, landscape, or we are seeing sooner than in other situations some already coordination and alignment?
Yeah, so the aim and purpose of the Biodiversity Credit Alliance is exactly that, is to try and bring all the actors in the market, this nascent market that's developing, and try and provide guidance and clarity to that market early on, rather than trying to retrofit principles at a later stage across all different kinds of standards or methodologies that are being developed. Rather try and create that North Star right from the beginning and try and pull everybody together to kind of, as I say, create that clarity. So we have the UNDP, the UNEP, the finance initiative, also facilitating the BCA. We as ValueNature are sitting in as a secretariat for now, but we are getting a coordinator that will come in and we'll step back. And so the structure of the BCA is that there's a task force that is made up of methodology developers, conservation organizations, research institutes that are really driving and leading the thinking around the BCA. And then we have a forum, which is interested parties that can participate and to be kept updated on what's happening in there and to provide feedback on any issue papers that we're developing out of the task force. And then in the task force, we've divided up into working groups with different kind of topics that we're addressing. So everything from trying to understand the demand. We've got quite a feisty group that's thinking about what is a biodiversity credit. There's a lot of different thinking about what actually constitutes a biodiversity credit, so it's important we get that right and present that to the broader community as early as possible. We've got another group thinking about developing a scientific peer review panel. We're talking now with Verra and other standard setters about a working group specifically for standard setters. So really trying to create alignment in the market as early as possible.
So basically, it's fair to say that you're going to try to bring into this space all the organizations that are also working on an element of the biodiversity credit market.
Yeah, so trying to create a united front, because I think from a demand perspective or potential buyers perspective, there's a lot of questions. And if we are all working in different silos, it's going to be very difficult for them to kind of gather information or really understand what's going on. And so we kind of liken what we're doing to the ICRO of the carbon market in a way, trying to provide those guardrails and kind of global principles as early on as possible for the market and for the methodology developers, the standard setters to understand those kind of principles that need to be followed and thought through.
Okay, so talking about the guiding principle, Mauricio, could you give us an example? I mean, at what level are you pitching this guide? We all have worked on guiding principles in our lives, but I think if we start sharing, we will see very different levels. So what are guiding principles for whom, at what level, how will they connect to the methodologies that are actually what you need on the ground? Give us an example.
So I think first, biodiversity credits are a new product, as you said, in an existing market, in an old market. And BCA, as Simon just says, is doing a great effort to work to these principles and to define these principles. So I'm going to talk about more or less 3 principles. Some of them come from the carbon market and from the lessons learned from the carbon market, and that's really important. The first one's traceability. Many people think about traceability in the transactions perspective, but I think we should think about traceability in the monitoring, reporting, and verification point of view. So data, information, and also the biodiversity credits should be traceable to all stakeholders. So that's the first. The second is transparency, and that comes also from the carbon market. There's a big opportunity here, and there's a lot of lessons learned from the carbon market. So biodiversity credits, its methodologies, but especially its cash flows, have to be transparent for everyone. So project developers and buyers, but especially, as Simon was saying, to biodiversity custodians. So these guys, the biodiversity custodians, have done huge efforts in conserving biodiversity, and they need to understand all the process that the biodiversity credits are and all the parts of the biodiversity credits. And the third one, and I think that's really important, and taking what Tim was saying, the inclusion and the practicality of the biodiversity credits. So there's a beautiful thing about biodiversity, and that is that everyone, that there's a lot of organizations, a lot of people, a lot of custodians that have been working with biodiversity for a long time and for decades. So people know what biodiversity means. And here we have a great opportunity because you don't need a PhD or you don't need a degree to understand what a biodiversity credit is. So here, from a project perspective, is that you can co-design and co-design the indicators for biodiversity monitoring and for biodiversity credit with communities, with custodians, and with the people who want to buy these credits. So I think those 3 principles are relevant for the biodiversity credit, and the Biodiversity Alliance is making good efforts in this.
So these principles will be relevant for the project developers, for the methodologies?
I think for the market they will be relevant, for the project developers, they will be also relevant because they need to be there, and all the credits in all the methodologies and in the different frameworks, so the flavors that Sinclair was saying, need to have these principles in mind for us to have like a well-designed credit, both for developers, both for buyers, and for custodians.
All right, so let's talk about concrete stuff. Sinclair, methodologies. So you as Verra, you're leading actually the process to develop a methodology. If we compare with the voluntary carbon market, where there are many methodology for different, what we call carbon credit types, right? So well, there are plenty for reforestation, for example. There are at least 2 for J-RED. There are few also for red, normal red, project red. How do you see this, the methodology going to develop, and in which directions? Are they going to be by type, by organization? Based on your experience, also knowledge on what type of interventions you could have to conserve biodiversity, what is your, thinking? I mean,
Yeah, it's a good question, and I recommend asking me again in the fall to see how much we stick with what I'm going to outline now, because we're learning by doing. But right now, our goal is to be able to develop 1, maybe 2 methodologies that could be modularized. And those modules may be split out by ecosystem type. You could think, marine versus terrestrial context. It could be conservation compared to restoration, although there's a spectrum there, so it's not necessarily easy to separate those out completely. But what we're trying to avoid is stalling the impact from actually happening on the ground, finance getting to these projects because of a lengthy methodology development process. So we don't want to have to push to the market for every different type of project to have to come and go through our methodology development process and spend a year plus doing that just so their particular activity type can qualify. So we are trying to have kind of a high enough level methodology that can encompass most, if not all, of the activity types that we anticipate participating in the program. And then we'll be able to add on and modularize as we need to for specific project contexts. Again, we'll see how possible that is, but the goal is to have simplicity. I think even from the investor perspective, this isn't any easier to communicate to their customers and investors than carbon. So how can we make something that is complex, like nature and biodiversity, as simple as possible, as low cost as possible to actually implement without sacrificing on integrity and rigor?
Just a quick follow-up question. How much of the new technologies for monitoring are you going to build in right from the start into the methodology so that it's kind of standardized their application?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully all of them. And that starts at what Verra is doing as a whole on digitizing everything when it comes to the methodologies that are being used in our VCS program. We're already starting to digitize those, so the idea for projects to be able to put their data into the system and it quantifies everything. So you have much more trust in the system and those quantifications, all the way to your project documentation being digitized. It's a lot easier than sending PDFs back and forth. So we can start with that, and then also on the monitoring side, so looking at satellite imagery, remote sensing, eDNA, all of those folks are here, so talk to them. We're working closely with them to figure out how can we write those, the criteria for monitoring at a high enough level to allow for what we already have for technology, as well as where we will continue to innovate and not have to stall the process as innovation continues.
Tim, 2 seconds. Because I know Mauricio wants to also, I think I would like to ask you also for, given the projects that you have already on the ground, how much of the, new technologies you actually are using?
Yeah, so I think the low cost is really important here that Sinclair just mentioned. So we've been trying to put in place eDNA, but it's, for the moment, it's way too expensive and the credits cannot accept that cost. But we've figured out how to put bioacoustics in our projects. So I think that's really important because it allows us to measure things that we haven't measured yet. So birds, frogs, insects, and how this diversity is changing through landscapes and through land covers. So I think that's really important, but we need to figure out how to lower the cost of these new technologies to put it in the biodiversity credit.
Yeah, that's a very important point, and open access and these kind of solutions. Tim, over to you. So you said you have a lot of experience in the U.S. What is, give us a little bit more of indication of how based on your experience, is there going to be a demand for these credits?
Yeah, so, and my focus in the US again is mostly in the offset space, but I want to describe there's only a few differences between voluntary and offset. One of them is much more price sensitivity. So, for example, in one of the regulated markets in the United States for nutrient credits, the price of a nutrient credit in the state of Virginia is approximately the same thing as the price of cocaine. If you're buying a pound of phosphorus from a forest-based project or a pound of cocaine on the street in New York City, they cost the same, right? There's no way the voluntary market bears that price. So that is a key difference, right, price. And the value of story and the value of co-benefits is much higher in the voluntary market. But the things that are really important lessons from a compliance or an offset market that we can get right, because we have lots of lessons learned in this, are that additionality, right? Additionality is, for many, many projects, is not actually that hard. It's only when you're doing something that really has probably got a lot of questions to it from the beginning that it's really hard to shoehorn out an additionality answer. And investors should pay attention to that. The additionality should be very obvious, very real. This is a property that's at extreme risk of development. This is a very degraded site that you're going to take to a different state. There's so much degraded land, right? 50% of the planet is in a degraded state. So finding easily restorable, protectable sites is not hard right now. Maybe in 50 years it is, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit for creditable activities. That's one lesson. Don't make mistakes on additionality. The second one is it's better to buy credits from for-profits than nonprofits. So in the short term, the nonprofits offer cheaper credits because they use their donor base and other access to philanthropic and government capital to pay for a lot of the brain loss that's associated with field development. So the prices of the credits are low. But in the long term, nonprofits that sell credits become a vested interest that keep the market from evolving toward higher and higher standards of additionality, higher and higher prices that actually reflect what it costs to deliver biodiversity. And then the last thing is the permanence and durability pieces. Those are built in to the point of the last panel and talking about de-risking. You can create an endowment on a site that provides long-term protection, both from force majeure events and from invasive species, like predictable events. So we can eventually price in really strong protection over a long period of time for durable biodiversity assets, just by using market mechanisms that are familiar to everybody else. And what we see in the United States now, there's a couple markets that are $1 billion plus in transactions a year, is there are project developers, just like there are for solar, people who go out and build a bank site, and once the bank is built and the first credits have been sold, someone else comes in and acquires the bank because it's a lower risk asset at that point. Once banks are fully sold or close to fully sold, that land is often transferred to a nonprofit. That's a great place for a nonprofit with a mission of conservation to come in and hold the title for the easement or the property in perpetuity. So there's a whole ecosystem of value providers that operate in the offset space that will evolve in the biodiversity space too.
Yeah. So going back to you, Simon, because I think this is what is really going to be important, is to have that kind of real good understanding of what are the principles that will govern this market. How do you position the BCA compared to, for example, the work that ICBCM is doing today with their vision of becoming, the body that governs the carbon market? Do you think that's the role that the Biodiversity Credit Alliance wants to play? And if you could also compare to other coalitions that have been, working in the past year, actually, for example, the World Economic Forum.
Yeah. So I think in terms of governing, I don't think that's the main purpose of the BCA. It's rather to provide those principles, those guidelines, and provide structure. And we're talking about technology. We're thinking about digital standards from a Web3 technology perspective that we'll develop early on so that those guidelines are in place and so that those processes. So again, that kind of North Star and ensuring that we have some kind of collective community that's all working in the same direction within that space. And so that speaks to the work that, for example, the World Economic Forum is doing. They're busy working on integrity principles at the moment. We're actively engaged with them. Those principles are going to need a home at the end of the day. And so that's what we're offering on providing and expanding on them. Nature Finance is working on governance principles at the moment. We're actively engaged with them as well. Same thing, we can adopt those principles that they're developing from a governance perspective and put them into our format. And so I think at the end of the day, it's about trying to create some kind of cohesion in the market space. Market space early on, and so that we can provide that clarity, as I said, from a starting point. But we can't afford to have, even though we need all the different groups thinking about these things, because biodiversity is complex, and so we don't want to stifle the market too early on. We're thinking about different types of methodologies, what needs to be developed, how do we include biodiversity custodians and things like that. And so we don't want to be over-prescriptive too early on, but by being inclusive of everybody and trying to kind of have these conversations openly amongst all the different members, I think will provide those kind of overarching principles and mechanisms that we need.
So my recommendation would be, given that also, the key would be to have a demand, because otherwise there is no market. Make sure that as you go on as the BCA, bringing all the players together and all the different components, which are absolutely critical, to have a buyer, a consumer-facing landing page, maybe
For sure.
even just to explain how to navigate this market. Because in the work that we were doing for the NCS carbon credits, and we start putting together the map of all the different actors for our buyers, is really complex.
Yeah.
So just for them to understand what do I need to know, right, and what I don't need to know.
Yeah. I think we need to have a whole kind of marketing effort at the end of the day. Once we kind of, we're looking forward to kind of launching the BCA formally towards the middle of the year, and I think through some of that is going to be in terms of kind of market engagement, engaging with the demand side, the buyers, potential buyers, providing those, as you say, those portals, those mechanisms of communication, and ensuring that they're there. We're obviously representing heavily on the seller side, but we need to start engaging more on the buyer side. And so, forums like this is exactly what we're trying to kind of drive for and trying to learn from as much as possible.
Sinclair, any suggestion on how to make this very, it's complex, and that's why we like nature and biodiversity. That's what it is. But how do we make it more simple, maybe for the consumer, the buyers that's their, that they're going to generate actually the financing for those?
Well, I think this is the first step, having an entity like the BCA. I'm sure we all wish that the ICVCM started 2 decades ago, and it would have been a lot easier job to do it incrementally, right? And so I think it's going to be hugely valuable to bring everyone together, to be able to have these dialogues going on the different pieces, and then be able to bring some of that, early trust in the market, even while we're very much in the development phase of it, but just start to bring information gradually to all of the different actors. I think that is huge, and it'll allow us to kind of build onto the market as different methodologies become developed, as the first transactions really start to take off. I think one of the other really key pieces is this Indigenous peoples and local community element. I think it's very hard for any individual or organization that fits into those groups to want to sign on or participate in the development process of any single methodology or framework. By having a group like the BCA, I think that gives them an opportunity to actually engage in a smart way that could, inform the entire market rather than one methodology or 2 methodologies, and give them much more of a comfortable space to actually provide input, which we absolutely have to get this right. So I think, to me, that's one of the biggest benefits in having that engagement from the very beginning, which I think we frankly missed in the carbon market.
Thank you. So we have 0 minutes left, sorry. But Tim and Mauricio, just 2 words about how do we, the value of having BCA and, in supporting the
There are a number of organizations that, I get you 2 words, a number of organizations willing to extend their reputations to create a stronger sense of the quality of the product. And that's what BCA is offering much earlier than in the carbon market.
Yeah, and there are a number of methodologies trying to put companies trying to put methodologies in the market, and the BCA is just gathering everyone and putting the principles in the table and allowing to hear the voice of everyone. I think that's very important.
So thank you very much. I think what Sinclair was saying, we wish we had actually ICVCM 20 years ago. By the way, ICVCM will launch the CCP, so the core carbon principles and the assessment framework on the 30th of March, so it's about to come out there. My suggestion is for any organization here that is engaged in the biodiversity credit to talk to Simon now, because it's important to be together right from the beginning, and I think that BCA is a great opportunity also that, thanks to UNDP, is offered to our community to actually do this together from the beginning. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for listening, and I'm sorry we didn't have a lot of time. We didn't have time at all for questions, but the speakers will be available during the coffee break.
So.